Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling an absolutely fascinating piece by Rudolf Okonkwo. He's a professor and an author, and the piece is called Behold, America the Beautiful. And it's really a look at American conservatism in a world that is changing. I mean, really changing at a dizzying pace.
Yeah, it really is.
And you're going to want to hear this because his writing, I mean, this is not your typical political analysis.
It's not dry at all.
No, he uses these vivid metaphors. He's even got biblical references in here, and it just makes you really stop and think.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about the way Okonkwo approaches this is that he really gets at the anxieties that a lot of people feel.
Right.
You know, especially maybe people who hold conservative values, as they look at this rapid change that's happening all around them in all facets of life.
Yeah, and he really doesn't waste any time getting to the heart of it right off the bat. He compares the 2020 election to a choice between a flawed human and a despicable human being. I mean, it's such a stark way to capture the emotional climate of that time. What do you think he's trying to say with that analogy?
I think he's highlighting this deep sense of disillusionment that I think a lot of voters were feeling. And it's not necessarily about specific policies even, or ideologies, but it's like longing for something familiar, you know, a yearning for simpler times in a world that just feels increasingly out of control.
Right. And he argues that, you know, this yearning for the familiar led many to choose that flawed option, even if it meant overlooking, you know, some serious issues, which I think is really interesting. It makes you think, how do we as individuals navigate those feelings of uncertainty and anxiety when it feels like the only constant is change?
Yeah.
Have you ever felt that pull towards the familiar?
Yeah.
Even when you know it might not be the best choice.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's such a human response.
Yeah.
You know, and I think Okonkwo is tapping into something really profound here. This idea that clinging to the past, trying to like hold back the tide of change can actually be a trap.
Right.
He calls it the tragedy of getting what they want, which is so interesting.
What could that look like in real life? I mean, on a personal level, or even on a larger societal scale.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It's this idea that like you achieve that perfect vision of the past that you've been clinging to. And then you find yourself isolated, out of touch, unable to cope with the world that has moved on without you.
Wow.
And he dives into some really specific examples of this. You know, he tackled these hot button issues like gay rights and immigration.
Right. And he doesn't really offer straightforward solutions. Instead, he throws out these wild, almost like satirical suggestions.
Yes.
He really pushes our buttons and makes us confront this inherent tension between conservative values and the changing realities of the world.
Absolutely.
So let's unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
He talks about things like working with Muslims to establish Sharia law in America as a way to make gays disappear, or even nuking major U.S. cities to stop immigration. I mean, he can't possibly be serious, can he?
Of course not. But that's where I think his brilliance lies. He's using absurdity to expose the flaws in trying to like force the world to fit a mold that just no longer exists.
Right.
So he's highlighting this inherent contradiction in trying to achieve socially conservative goals through means that would like fundamentally alter the fabric of American society.
So it's not about the literal solutions. It's about the deeper critique. He's forcing us to confront the impracticality, maybe even the impossibility of imposing a vision of the past onto a future. That's unfolding in a very different direction.
Absolutely.
It's almost like he's saying, look, if you want to achieve these goals, you got to find a different approach, one that acknowledges the realities of a changing world.
Exactly.
And it's not just social issues either. He applies this logic to economic challenges, global power dynamics, even the decline of traditional religious institutions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really a sweeping critique. That forces us to reconsider what it means to be conservative in a world that's constantly evolving.
Yeah, it really does.
So where does that leave us? If clinging to the past isn't the answer, then what is? How do we reconcile traditional values with a world that's constantly shifting beneath our feet?
Right.
I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that we'll explore in more depth as we kind of dive deeper into his analysis.
Okay.
But before we do that, I think it's worth maybe zooming in on one of the most significant challenges he raises, which is this issue of gay rights.
Okay.
And how it intersects with this broader tension between tradition and change.
All right, let's dive into that, because this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable for some.
When it comes to gay rights, Okonkwo paints this fascinating And I'll be honest, a kind of provocative picture of the future. He argues that, like, even in the most remote corners of the country, that traditional view of marriage and family will eventually become a distant memory.
So he's essentially saying that greater acceptance of LGBTQ plus rights, it's inevitable, no matter how much resistance there is.
That's exactly what he's suggesting. And to illustrate this point, he uses this really jarring analogy. He says that if conservatives truly want to see gays disappear, they'd have to work with Muslims to establish Sharia law in America.
Whoa, that's intense. Talk about an unlikely alliance.
You're right, but that's the point. He's deliberately creating this absurd scenario to highlight the contradiction.
Okay, so he's saying that trying to achieve a socially conservative outcome, but using methods that completely contradict American values, is ultimately self-defeating. It'd be like winning the battle but losing the war.
Precisely. And it speaks to this broader point he makes throughout the piece, this idea that clinging to outdated solutions, trying to force the world to conform to a vision of the past, could actually lead to consequences that are far more disruptive and damaging than the changes they're trying to resist.
So it's not just about gay rights. It's about this whole way of thinking, about change and how we respond to it. And it makes you wonder if pushing back against these social and cultural shifts with the same old tactics, if that just won't work, then what are the alternatives? How do we navigate these changes in a way that honors both our values and the realities of a changing world?
Right. That's the challenge he lays out, I think, not just for conservatives.
Yeah.
And it's a challenge that's particularly relevant when we look at another complex issue he tackles, immigration.
Right. He doesn't hold back on this one either. He argues that even deporting millions of undocumented immigrants wouldn't actually solve the problem. And then he goes on to suggest that the only way to truly stop immigration is to nuke major U.S. cities.
It's definitely a shocking image. But again, we have to remember that Okonkwo was a master of satire. He's using hyperbole to make us think critically about the forces driving immigration and the futility of trying to shut America off from the rest of the world.
So he's not advocating for nuclear annihilation. He's using this extreme example to illustrate the interconnectedness of the world and the limitations of isolationist policies. It's like he's saying, look, even if you could somehow stop immigration completely, would that really make America better off? Or would it cut us off from the economic and cultural dynamism that comes from being a global hub?
Exactly. He's challenging this idea that we can simply build walls, both literally and metaphorically, and expect to solve complex problems like immigration.
Right.
And this leads him to another key point, the rise of China and the limits of American influence in a rapidly changing global landscape.
Okay. This is where I get really interested. We hear so much about the so-called China threat these days. How does Okonkwo approach this issue?
Well, his take is quite surprising. He acknowledges China's growing economic and military power, but he argues that its rise is largely a consequence of forces that are beyond any one nation's control. He even points out that American companies, in their pursuit of cheaper labor and higher profits, actually played a role in China's ascent.
So he's saying that we can't just blame China for our problems. We have to acknowledge the role our own actions and choices have played in shaping the current global order.
Exactly. And this insight is crucial because it challenges us to think differently about how we engage with China instead of trying to contain or isolate them. Okonkwo suggests that we need to find a way to coexist, to cooperate and to compete in a way that benefits both nations and the world as a whole.
It's a much more nuanced and pragmatic view than we typically hear in political discourse these days. And it raises an important question. Can American conservatism adapt to this new reality, this multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower? Or will it cling to an outdated worldview that's increasingly out of step with the times?
That's the central tension, I think, that Okonkwo is exploring throughout this piece.
Yeah.
And he doesn't shy away from addressing another issue. That's often at the heart of conservative anxieties. Economic inequality.
Okay, let's talk about that. This is something that affects so many people, regardless of their political affiliation. How does Okonkwo frame this issue within his broader critique of American conservatism?
He makes a rather bold statement. He suggests that even with a conservative president and Republican-controlled Congress, the American working class will still end up paying more in taxes than the wealthy.
Wow, that's provocative. I mean, isn't that a direct challenge to the core tenets of conservative economic policy?
Absolutely. And it's even more striking when you consider his proposed solution. He suggests that the only way to change this dynamic is for conservatives to grow a heart, to abandon their belief in trickle-down economics and embrace policies that promote greater economic equality.
It's like he's saying, look, if you truly care about the well-being of all Americans, you can't just focus on cutting taxes for the wealthy and hoping that prosperity will somehow trickle down to everyone else. You have to be willing to address the structural imbalances in our economy and create a system that's fair for everyone. And it raises a fascinating question. Can American conservatism reconcile its traditional emphasis on free markets and individual responsibility with the growing need for government intervention to address issues like income inequality and social mobility?
That's a question that goes to the very heart of the debate about the future of conservatism in America.
It really does.
And it leads us to another deeply personal and often contentious issue that Okonkwo tackles, the decline of traditional churches and the anxieties it provokes among many conservatives.
Okay, let's dive into that, because it's a topic that's often overlooked in discussions about politics and social change. How does Okonkwo connect the decline of traditional churches to his broader critique of American conservatism?
Well, he starts by acknowledging the very real concerns of conservatives who see the declining influence of traditional churches as a sign of moral decay and societal decline.
Right. There's this sense that the values and institutions that once held society together are crumbling, and that's a frightening prospect for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But instead of offering comforting reassurances or proposing ways to revitalize traditional churches, Okonkwo goes in a completely different direction.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What does he suggest?
Well, he throws out this wildly provocative idea that the only way to reverse the decline of traditional churches is to adopt a much more fundamentalist approach, almost like a Christian version of Sharia law.
Whoa, hold on a second. Is he seriously talking about implementing religious law in America?
Of course not. Remember, Okonkwo is a master of satire. He's using this extreme scenario to make a deeper point about the limitations of trying to force religious observance through stricter rules or punishments.
Okay, so it's not about literally imposing religious law. It's about exposing the flaws in the logic of those who believe that we can legislate morality, that we can somehow coerce people into being more religious.
Precisely. And this speaks to a broader theme that runs throughout his analysis. This idea that clinging to the past, trying to force the world to conform to a vision that may no longer be relevant, is ultimately counterproductive.
So if all these solutions are really critiques in disguise, what is Okonkwo truly trying to say about the future of American conservatism?
That's where I think his central argument comes into sharp focus. He's essentially suggesting that American conservatism, as it's currently constituted, is struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing world.
It seems like he's saying that clinging to the past, resisting change, is ultimately a losing strategy.
Precisely. He argues that politicians often exploit this fear of change, by pointing fingers at other people, scapegoating them for complex problems that have no easy solutions.
So instead of addressing the real challenges, they distract us with fear-mongering and divisive rhetoric.
Exactly.
And he argues that this tactic, while effective in the short term, ultimately prevents us from having honest conversations about the real solutions we need to find. So what does he propose as an alternative? How does he think American conservatism should respond to these challenges?
That's where his powerful metaphor of the evolution train comes into play.
Okay. I'm really curious to hear about this evolution train metaphor. Tell me more.
Yeah, so he's using this image of a train that's constantly moving forward. And it's symbolizing that relentless pace of change, in the world.
Yeah.
And his point is we can't stop this train no matter how hard we try. Those who try to jump off, to resist that forward momentum, they're the ones who are going to be left behind, lost and disconnected from the world as it evolves.
So instead of trying to halt progress, he's suggesting we need to figure out how to ride the train, adapt to the changes, navigate the journey as best we can. It makes you wonder, though, how do we hold on to our values and principles while still embracing the inevitable changes that are happening all around us? It feels like a delicate balancing act.
It is. It is a delicate balancing act. And I think Okonkwo's piece doesn't necessarily offer any easy answers, but it does provide, I think, a really powerful framework for thinking about this challenge. He's urging us to move beyond those simplistic solutions and confront the complexities of a world that's constantly in flux.
He seems to be pushing back against this idea that we can simply return to some idealized version of the past. Instead, he's saying we need to be forward-thinking and find ways to adapt our values and principles to the realities of the present and the future. Does that mean abandoning our core beliefs?
Not necessarily.
Oh.
I think what he's suggesting is that we need to be willing to re-examine our assumptions, challenge our own biases, and be open to new perspectives. He's calling for a more nuanced and pragmatic approach, one that recognizes the limits of clinging to outdated ideologies in a world that's constantly evolving.
And he ties all of this together with a really striking concluding statement. Behold, America, the beautiful, where the daughters of the uncircumcised will one day rejoice. Not just today. There's a lot to unpack there. What do you make of that? Especially that phrase, daughters of the uncircumcised.
It's a powerful image. It's drawing on biblical language to evoke this idea of those who are different, those who exist outside the traditional norms and expectations of society. In this context, it could refer to anyone who has been marginalized or excluded: immigrants, people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, those who hold different religious beliefs, anyone who doesn't fit the mold of what some might consider traditional America.
So when he says these daughters of the uncircumcised will one day rejoice, is he suggesting a more inclusive future for America? A future where diversity is celebrated rather than feared?
That's certainly one way to interpret it. It suggests a vision of America where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background, beliefs, or identity. But he adds this really important caveat: not just today.
That's a crucial detail. What do you think he's getting at with that phrase?
I think it's a reminder that progress takes time, that building a more inclusive and equitable society is a long and often difficult journey. There will be setbacks, there will be challenges along the way, and achieving this vision requires constant effort, vigilance, and a willingness to challenge injustice wherever we see it.
So it's not a guarantee, but a possibility, a potential future that we need to actively work towards. And he frames this call to action within this idea of, behold, America, the beautiful, which invokes this sense of patriotism, of hope, and maybe even a challenge to live up to our ideals.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even amidst all the complexities and challenges, there's still a fundamental beauty in the American experiment, in this idea of a nation striving to create a more perfect union. And that striving, that ongoing effort to live up to our ideals is what makes America truly beautiful.
It's like he's saying that the true essence of America isn't about clinging to a static vision of the past, but about embracing the dynamism, the diversity, and the ever-evolving nature of our nation. It's about recognizing that change is inevitable, and that our strength lies in our ability to adapt, evolve, and find unity amidst our differences.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think resonates far beyond the realm of politics. It's a message that speaks to the human spirit, to our capacity for growth, change, and the pursuit of a more just and equitable world.
Okonkwo has certainly given us a lot to think about. He's challenged us to question our assumptions, confront our biases, and engage in a meaningful dialogue about the challenges we face as a nation. What stands out to you most from this deep dive, and what questions are you left pondering as we navigate this ever-changing world?
For me, it's that reminder that we're all on this evolution train together. We can choose to resist the journey, cling to the past, and risk being left behind, or we can embrace the ride, engage with the challenges, and work together to create a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. The choice is ours.
Okonkwo's piece is a call to action. It's an invitation to participate in shaping the future of our nation and the world. It's a reminder that the journey is ongoing, and that the true beauty of America lies not in a static vision of the past, but in our collective effort to create a more perfect union for ourselves and for generations to come.